I'm William Bell with Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. Welcome to Probing the Prophets with Rod MacArthur. Join us every Friday from 11 a.m. until 12 noon Central Standard Time for an exciting adventure through the prophets with Rod MacArthur. Rod MacArthur, husband, father, grandfather, gardener of roses and veggies, Bible student, enamored of the prophets since 1972, hosts a discussion 40 years in the making. Currently living in Auburn, Washington, Rod has preached in Moscow, Idaho, Spokane, Washington, and Terre Haute, Indiana, before moving to Auburn. Welcome to Probing the Prophets with Rod.
Hello again, it's Rod, and I am here to continue our study in Genesis. This is a great book, underrated, underestimated, and superficialized, I think, to our own detriment. There is much more going on in this book than appears on the surface, and much more for us to discover than just repeating certain numbered things like the days of creation or the, as you know, the various other things, the 12 sons of Israel and the numbered things. There's a lot more in here. We pointed out last week that the book has a really interesting division. One of the more superficial pieces of it is that it starts with 4 key events: creation, the fall, the flood, and the tower events. And then that's followed by 4 significant men: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. The storyline centers around those events and those men. And of course, as we pointed out last time, the hero of the book is Yahweh. It is as though Moses had handed to Israel, coming out of captivity, a reason to follow Yahweh. I heard a very powerful lesson last night. It was called The Covenant-Making God. And the brother argued that the Hittite people who were in the land before Israel took the land, that they were in the, and I don't mean just the land of Palestine, I mean in the general area, a massive nation actually. Uriah the Hittite was one of David's powerful men. The Hittites had a system of making covenants, and it essentially involved the deity or the sovereign identifying himself, I am Yahweh. Then, for example, then step 2 of, here is what I have done for you. I am Yahweh who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Then there was a call for loyalty. I will be your God. You will be my people. Listen to what I say, and I will lead you. And then finally, there would be repercussions. If you follow me, I will bless you. If you do not, here are the curses and what you should expect. And so when Israel entered into covenant at Mount Sinai, for example, I am Yahweh who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Be my sons and daughters. I will be your God. I will bless you if you follow me, and here is the curse that comes when you disobey. We don't generally think of the book of Genesis as being a covenant with man, and yet it is. Here is, I am Yahweh. Here's what I have made for you, a garden and all of these things. Follow me. I'll be your God. And if you don't, I'll kick you out of the garden. In the day that you eat, you will surely die. We might think that Genesis 2 is the first command that God gave man, but really it isn't. In Genesis 1, verse 28, and God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the land and subdue it. rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So here is, I have blessed you. Now, take charge. Be over this. So we're looking then at the book of Genesis, not just as a book of creations, but as a covenant-making God. And as I was saying, Moses handed this record, 4 key events, 4 significant men, God interacting with mankind throughout all of these. Here is your God, O Israel, who is bringing you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Here's what he has meant to you in the past. Now, give him your heart. Let him bless you. I believe that's what Genesis meant to be. Many things on top of that, but that's the deep essence of it. Why should Israel follow Yahweh? Remember what Pharaoh said. Who is Yahweh that I should let his people go? I don't know him, and besides, I'm not going to let them go. It's very likely that Israel didn't have much clearer understanding of Yahweh than Pharaoh did. So the book of Genesis has Yahweh as its hero. It presents the covenant-making God to a people who are called to enter into covenant with him. So we covered down through chapter 3, and the first 2 major events, that is creation, chapters 1 and 2, the fall here in chapter 3. Well, the fall continues to tumble as we go on into chapter 4, but I remind us of the significant temple type of details that we picked up in chapter 2 concerning the garden, the paradise of God, but temple details, the living water that flowed from it, even as the living water flowed from the messianic temple of Ezekiel, and even as the living water flowed from the throne of God in the book of Revelation, in the picture of the bride, the New Jerusalem, being on earth for God and man to live in together, and the water of life flowing from there. And so we see that water of life, that living water motif here in Genesis 2. We see the precious stones that continue to circulate through the temple imagery, both in the tabernacle as the priests wore their garments, and in the depiction of the New Jerusalem that Isaiah gives us, and then that John gives us in the book of Revelation. So we see a significant imagery of the temple, where and a temple was that place where God and man came together, where God met with man. And the veil of the temple being removed in Jesus opened up closed the breach and opened the door that had been closed and the breach that had been made by Adam and Eve when they sinned. Here in chapter 3, remember there was a cherubim the cherubim were stationed at the entrance to the garden with a flashing sword, a flaming sword, which turned in every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. Man can't take of this now. We have to fix things. So we have a garden that is waiting, the man expelled from the garden, and the cherubim blocking his re-entrance. And so we have the gauntlet thrown down, the story laid out before us. But we also had, just before we saw man kicked out, we saw a promise in Genesis 3:15 that God would undo the damage through the seed of woman, that he would undo the damage that the serpent had caused. And we see man dying to God that day, man being promised that he would physically return to the dust, and man being expelled from the garden. Yet there was this, I will crush the serpent under the foot, under the heel of the offspring of woman. So that's another interesting theme, by the way, that runs through the Bible. That is this one that would be born, this offspring. Here it's the offspring of woman. In Genesis 12, it's the offspring of Abraham. In 2 Samuel 7, it's the offspring of David. And throughout the book of Isaiah, a son, a child will be born. So we have this picture of just a baby coming to rescue man. It kind of makes you think that that's probably where David got the idea for Psalm 8, that God established strength in the mouth of a babe, that you establish strength. Let me get that. I'm botching the quote of it. And so that's Psalm, the 8th Psalm, where David said, how majestic is your name in all the earth, O Yahweh our Lord. How majestic is your name in all the earth, who has displayed your splendor above the heavens. From the mouth of infants and nursing babes, you have established strength because of your adversaries. That's got to remind you of Genesis 3, verse 15, where the offspring of woman, the seed of woman, would crush the adversary. And that picture is, as we've just said, carried throughout the rest of the Bible. Promises made to David and through the prophets, and then the work of Jesus. And you even see it in Revelation 12, where the woman gave birth to a boy whom Satan tried to destroy but could not, who then valiantly in chapter 19 came back and destroyed all the adversaries of God. What a beautiful picture. But it has its roots here, you see, in Genesis. So with that promise and man being expelled from the garden, we now see the deterioration that takes place because man decided to do it his own way rather than the way of God. In other words, has God said, and you shall surely die? You aren't going to die, Satan said. And when the woman saw that it was good for food and a delight to the eyes and desirable to make one wise, she took and ate and gave it to her husband, and he ate too. So rather than trusting and believing God, they launched out on their own, and they were kicked out from the garden. And now we see that kind of self-will, what it does in their family life. There's here in chapter 4, the story how Cain was a gardener and Abel was a keeper of flocks, and the older brother Cain, the younger brother Abel. And in the course of time, Cain brought an offering from the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought the firstlings of his flock. Yahweh had regard for Abel and for his offering, but for Cain and his, he had no regard. I reject that. That's kind of an interesting thought, and this is kind of sidebar outside of where I was wanting to go with this discussion today. But the sidebar is you don't just bring anything and think because you've offered it to God, He accepts it. Clearly, there were reasons that God rejected Cain's. It cannot be, by the way, that He rejected it because it wasn't a blood sacrifice. We read in the New Testament, Hebrews 11, that by faith, Abel offered a better sacrifice. So whatever it was that Cain did, it was not done by faith in God. It was done for some other motive, some other discipline behind it than faith in God. And I submit to you that that's why God rejected it, because it was, again, self-willed, just like Adam and Eve, self-willed. Well, this got under Cain's skin, as you know. His he let it work on his brain, and the brain makes all this wonderful negative chemistry, and you get sad or depressed or angry or whatever because of your bad thoughts. And so he rose up and killed his brother. And that's what I want to talk about. In verse 8, and Cain told Abel, his brother, and it came about when they were in the field. So Cain's talking to Abel about his disappointment, his disgust with God, his rejection by God, and his discouragement, his dropped countenance. He's talking to his brother about all these things, and somehow they got into something, because Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him. So the argument flared up, or whatever it was, to the point of murder. And Yahweh said to Cain, "Where is Abel, your brother?" And he said, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? Am I responsible for him?" Well, the reality is that God puts the care of our brother in our hands. And so the answer would be, well, yes, you are. But God doesn't go down that path. He goes down this path. What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Now, there's two thoughts that I want to highlight on this. The one is the horror of murder. And this is a theme that ripples through the prophets, because there was so much murder taking place in the godless society of Jerusalem, so much murder that was being perpetrated that was not being dealt with by the justice system, that there was not the covering of the blood. And there is a covering of the blood that takes place when the murderer is put to death. When the murderer's life is taken in exchange for the life that he took, the blood is said to be covered. So the one thing is the danger that comes to a society because of murder that is not balanced by taking the life of the murderer. How many times does God say in the book of Deuteronomy, for example, "Do not let your eye pity"? I'm going to require of you some challenging things, some things that are going to go against your judgment, your reason, your sympathies, and your sympathies are going to keep you from acting in a way that will do the job, and you will suffer in the future because you didn't follow my instructions. Now, I want to be quick to say that that's not God in a snit saying, "You're not going to listen to me, well, I'm going to twerk you off." If you're not going to listen to me, you're not going to avoid the dangers that I see that you don't see, and you're unwilling to follow me, so you're going to go into those dangers I'm trying to save you from. And so here, the blood of a murderer, the blood of the murderer's victim, cries out for justice, and can only be covered by the blood of the murderer. And God says, "Don't let your eye pity." And we have too much soft-heartedness going on in our society, where there's too much pitying of, "Oh, well, how do we know we get the right guy?" And it's such an irreversible thing. I'm against the death penalty. When here is God saying that your brother's blood is crying out to me. We'll see over later in Genesis chapter 9, where God says, "Here's what I want you to do. When any man sheds another man's blood, here's what you have to do." But so I've spent way too much time on that piece of it, because the real piece that I want to look at is, here is blood crying out. The blood of Abel crying out. It's something that shouldn't be, but consider what Jesus said over here in Matthew chapter 23. In Matthew 23, as Jesus is pronouncing a series of woes, he says in verse 35, in 33, he says, "How shall you escape the sentence of a Gehenna? How shall you, the corrupt society of Jerusalem in the day of Jesus, how shall you, corrupt society, escape the sentence of Gehenna? Therefore I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that upon you may fall all the righteous blood shed on the land, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things shall come upon this generation." Interesting to me that the covenant judgment, the bringing of the covenant curses that we read about in Deuteronomy 28 or Leviticus 26, those curses were to cover all the blood shed on the land all the way back to Abel. So that tells me that we are on the right track when we see the creation account as being a covenant account with the lineage of Adam. And so the judgment against Jerusalem included God making right the death of Abel here in Genesis 4. It reaches well back, doesn't it? It goes deep into their history. And I think that's the key thing. It's their history. There's some thoughts that I want to share with you then. We have this reading here in Matthew 23. It's very similar. I think there's some nuanced differences in Luke 11, where the same judgment against Jerusalem is being pronounced. But listen to how this one reads. In Luke 11 at verse 51, but I'm going to back up a little bit. He says in verse 49, "For this reason also the wisdom of God said, I will send to them prophets and apostles, and of them they will kill, and of them they will persecute, in order that the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world may be charged against or required of this generation." So you see a bit of a nuance there, where in Matthew it was just all the blood. Here it is the blood of the prophets shed since the foundation of the world. And in Matthew it was that was shed on the land. Here it's since the foundation of the world, cosmos, the orderly arrangement, and that is typically the description of what happens when there's a covenant in place that arranges things, and that it may be charged against this generation from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the house. Yes, I tell you, it shall be charged against this generation. So the point, of course, is that Abel is called a prophet. And the death of that prophet by his brother, and that's another interesting nuance, that here was a child of God, killed by his brother. You come down to the days following the death of Jesus. And by the way, who put Jesus to death? Well, who were the main persecutors of the children of God that were coming into Christ? Was it not their brothers, that is, the physical covenant people? The physical covenant people were persecuting the spiritual covenant people. Paul, picking up the allegory of Hagar and Sarah, said that the son of the free woman, just like in those days, was being tormented and persecuted by the son of the bondwoman. And so the son of the bondwoman was cast out, so he might not inherit with the son of the free woman. Paul says that's an analogy of what's happening in Paul's day. The son of the free woman, the Christians, were being persecuted by the sons of the bondwoman, that is, physical Israel. And so you have the same picture here in Genesis 4, where the brother rose up and killed brother, whom Luke called a prophet. So it's and this story continues to percolate through the New Testament. Over twice in Hebrews, we have a reference to Abel. In Hebrews 11, at verse 4, one I mentioned a minute ago, by faith Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained the testimony that he was righteous, God testifying about his gifts, and through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks. So we're even now, 2,000 years later, we're still learning and repeating the lesson of Abel. In chapter 12 of Hebrews 12:24, the Hebrews writer says, you Christians have come not to Mount Sinai, but to Mount Zion. You've come to the heavenly Jerusalem, to the myriad of angels. You've come to the city of the living God. You've come to the church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven. You've come to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of righteous men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood, which speaks better than that of Abel. So Abel's blood said something, but Jesus' blood says something better than what Abel's blood said. Abel's blood called for judgment upon Israel, as we saw in Matthew 23 and Luke 11. Jesus' blood also called for judgment upon Israel. 1 Thessalonians 2, Paul says, since they killed the Lord Jesus and cast us out and hinder us from preaching to the Gentiles that they might save, he says, therefore wrath has come upon them to an end. And so Jesus' blood spoke better and more volume, called for the same judgment, but also allowed some people to escape that judgment, which is the Hebrews writer's point. And then one final reference to Abel in the New is over here in 1 John chapter 3 at verse 12. I'm start at 11. For this is the message which you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another, not as Cain was of the evil one and slew his brother. And why did he slay him? Because his deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. So let's not be like Cain, let's be like Abel. Well, that's tracing the impact of Cain, the impact of Abel, then through the Bible, but especially on into the New. So we have that story there in chapter 4, the spread of self-will, and even to the point of killing one's brother. So, It says in verse 16 that Cain went out from the presence of Yahweh and settled in the land of Nod east of Eden, and you can read the story of what went forth from there. But we come back to verse 25, where Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. For God has appointed me another offspring in the place of Abel, for Cain killed him. And so then the rest of this chapter and on through chapter 5, the lineage of the God followers. Can we say it that way? The lineage of the God followers. We know that in chapter 6, we have the sons of God marrying the daughters of men. In context, chapter 5 is telling you who the sons of God are. We have also then in chapter 4, the daughters of men. You see Cain going off and finding a wife out there outside the garden. And, well, of course, they were kicked out of the garden, but the point is it wasn't within the territory of God. It wasn't within relationship with God that Cain took his wife. So you've already got these two lines, and there's an implication that there are people out there for Cain to find his wife from outside. As he fled from the presence of God's people, he found a wife out there. So you've got these two lines of people. Chapter 5 recounts the line of the sons of God. Chapter 6, they merge, where the sons of God see the women of the world as being desirable. And it cannot be because they have a godliness about them. It has to be some other reason, like they're good to look at, and and so some of the reasons, some of the things that Eve saw about the fruit, the sons of men are seeing about the daughters, the sons of God are seeing about the daughters of men. They've got this voluptuousness about them that they're desirable, but not for spiritual reasons. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself because there's one thing that I wanted to connect up with in chapter 5, and that is we have the person of Enoch mentioned. The structure in 5 is really simple. A man is mentioned, Adam, for example, and he lived so long and then gave birth to a son. He lived 130 years, became the father of Seth. 130 years and became the father of Seth. And then after Seth, he lived another 800 years with other sons and daughters. And so his total time was 930 years, and he died. So there's this unto dust you shall return brought forth for every person. And so each one of these. So Seth is going to live so long, have a son, we'll know the name of the son, he'll have other sons and daughters in the rest of the time that he lived, and then the total that he lived, and he died. And that's going to be repeated for every one of these, except we come down here in verse 18, Jared lived 162 years, became the father of Enoch. Then Jared lived 800 years after he became the father of Enoch and had sons and daughters. So all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. And Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah. Then Enoch here's the change. Enoch walked with God and walked with God 300 years after he became the father of Methuselah. And he had sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 360 years, and Enoch walked with God. And he was not, for God took him. It didn't say, and he died. It just said, he just left. He walked a righteous life, and he left. And so Enoch is interesting. We saw already that in the book of Jude, that you have the such and such from Enoch, and the seventh from Enoch. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied these various things, and we talked about that at that time. But there's a couple other places where Enoch is mentioned, and some of them are just in genealogy, like you find him in First Chronicles chapter 1. He's mentioned, his chronology is mentioned there, but we have him also then in the Jude passage. So we have him in Genesis 5, and we have him in Chronicles, 1 Chronicles 1. Enoch lived 65 years, became the father of Methuselah. Enoch walked with God. All his days were 365. Then there's Methuselah. He lived 187 years, became the father of Lamech. As you know, Lamech then became the father of Noah. And it looks to me like Lamech died before his son. Methuselah outlived his father. Here's another interesting thing, that Methuselah, my mind just went blank. Never mind. Methuselah died in the year of the flood. Whether he died in the flood or not, I couldn't tell you, but I know that he died in the year of the flood. And that brings us to Noah, and probably as far as we will get today, chapter 6. And it came about, verse 1, when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and took wives for themselves whomever they chose. Now it is sheer idiocy to think that the sons of God are anything other than the offspring of Adam, the lineage of Adam through Seth. To think that, the sons of God here, these are angels, and the angels are getting married to human beings, and Jesus himself says, well, they'll neither marry nor give in marriage, but will be like the angels in heaven. I mean, it's idiocy to make anything supernatural or sensational out of this, and not see the sheer horror of it. The horror of it is that the breakdown between righteous and self-willed is taking place here over the appearance of a woman. They looked good. See, the sons of the daughters of men looked good. Now, New American Standard translates that were beautiful, but really they looked good. And so they took whomever they chose. And so, like Eve took the fruit because she wanted to, godly people are marrying ungodly people because they want to. And it's just their will, not God's. It's taking place. Anyway, God said, Yahweh said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever. I'm just tired of what's going on here, and it's not going to be a continual struggle between me and him, because he's flesh. And I love what David says over here in, I'm going to see if I can get this right, Psalm 103, I believe it is, where David said, he has not, verse 10, he has not dealt with us according to our sins, nor rewarded us according to our iniquities. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his loving kindness toward those who fear him. As far as east is from the west, as so far has he removed our transgressions from us. just as a father has compassion on his children, so Yahweh has compassion on those who fear him. For he himself knows our frame. He is mindful that we are dust. So God knows our frailties. And he says, I'm not going to struggle with them forever because they're flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. I don't think he was here setting a length of life. That is, you can have a life expectancy of 120 years. Moses knew it was less than that in Psalm 90. I think rather that what God is doing here is saying, I'm giving you 120 years to repent, 120 years to change, and then I'll act. So the first observation is, wow, look at the long-suffering of God. It wasn't, I'm so ticked off at this, zap, you're gone. He says, I'm going to try to make a difference. We know from the books of Peter and Jude, 2 Peter and Jude, that Peter was a preacher of righteousness. Noah was a preacher of righteousness. Noah tried to persuade men to change and become righteous. It didn't work, but God's long-suffering waited these 120 years. It says the Nephilim were on the land in those days. It just simply means big people. It doesn't necessarily mean big in stature, like giants 18 feet 3 inches, but big, prominent people. Could be powerful like business moguls, men who had a lot of clout. Can fit that concept right there. And also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore to them, those were the mighty men of old, men of renown. Then Yahweh saw that the wickedness of man was great on the land, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And Yahweh was sorry that he had made man on the land, and was grieved in his heart. And Yahweh said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals, to creeping things, to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I made them. It's interesting, isn't it? Verse 7, here itemizing who he would blot out. This is the same list that you have back in chapter 1 at verse 28, where he says, be fruitful, multiply, and subdue these various things. So I'm going to blot them all out now. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So in verse 6, he was sorry because that man was on the earth, because man had polluted it. Verse 5, his wickedness was great, and I'm going to blot them out. In verse 11, the land was corrupt in the sight of God, and the land was filled with violence. So we have the natural, expected, ultimate consequence of man not listening to God and doing it his own way. We see here that it brought about such a corruption that God said, I need to wipe it out. And this idea of corruption, I want to pursue that. We have in Deuteronomy chapter 32, we have the Song of Moses, and God says a couple things in verses 1 through 4. Here is the great, awesome God. Now remember, part of the essence, part of the details of a covenant is the deity or the sovereign. The sovereign could be a king, the sovereign could be the God. The sovereign identifies himself. I am Yahweh. And then the sovereign identifies what he has done, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, who brought back Jesus from the dead. This great delivering power. Why should I put my loyalty to you? Well, because I can, and I have delivered you. Okay, so verses 1 through 4 here of Deuteronomy 32 is a recounting of the greatness of God. But then in verse 5, they have acted corruptly toward him. Now, I could read more on into Deuteronomy 32, and there's a couple places where he says, they're not my sons. They are a corrupt generation. See, that's there in verse 5. That's also in verse 20 of Deuteronomy 32. But here back in Genesis 6, the land had become so corrupt that God had to bring a judgment against it. In Deuteronomy 32, there were the adversaries that would be judged, and that there were the people that would be avenged. God had both going on there. Well, he's got both going on here in Genesis as well. And so I'm submitting to you that what we have in Genesis is the type, the picture, the illustration, the first iteration, as it were, of a covenant judgment of God against his people. His people have polluted themselves. His people have corrupted themselves. His people have filled the earth, the land, with violence here in Genesis 6. Well, in Deuteronomy 32, Moses is saying that generation that God wipes out, that last generation, that's full of corruption and violence also. So, it's fascinating parallel. Over in the book of Malachi, now Malachi, as you know, is the last of the Old Testament voices, Old Covenant voices, and he really, and oh, by the way, you want to do a David Curtis here, it's a perfectly wonderful thing to do. I've done it, and that is that inappropriate is a better word. It's not inadvertent, it's there on purpose, but it's inappropriately there. That blank sheet of paper between Malachi 4 and Matthew 1 that says the new covenant, tear it out. It doesn't need to be there. In fact, it's a barrier to the flow of thought. Malachi ends introducing John the Baptist. Matthew begins introducing John the Baptist. So, it's just the story continues. Get rid of that barrier. Well, if you don't, that's fine too. That's your Bible, not mine. But in Malachi, so we have this last voice of the Old Covenant. And it's depicting a place where, again, man has chosen, God's people have chosen to do it their own way. And he's highlighted some things like corruption in the sacrifice, corruption in the priesthood, corruption in the marriage. And so in verse 2:17, you have wearied Yahweh with your words. Yet you say, how have we wearied? In that you say, everyone who is evil is good in the sight of Yahweh. So you got some people saying, yeah, look, God is smiling upon us, and we're doing the things you said that we're not supposed to be doing, and yet we're being blessed. But you also have others that say, where is the God of justice? So one group of people saying everyone who does evil in the sight of Yahweh is good in the sight of Yahweh, and he delights in them. Look, I'm being blessed by Yahweh. The wicked people are saying. The good people are saying, where is the God of justice? How come nothing's being done about us? And so you've got this wickedness as well as this sense of being abandoned by God. We're doing the right thing and nothing good is happening to us. You got the crybabies and the braggarts. See, you got some saying God doesn't care and we can do whatever we want. The other saying God doesn't care and we're getting beat up. Both are saying God is unattentive. And so where is the God of justice? And Malachi goes on to say, I am going to send my messenger, and he will clear the way before me. So John the Baptist is going to make a way for Yahweh himself. And Yahweh, whom you seek, will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight. Behold, he is coming, says Yahweh of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming? And who can stand when he appears? For he's like a refiner's fire and a fuller's soap. A refiner's fire gets rid of the dross. Fuller's soap gets rid of the dirt. Either way, we're cleaning it up. And he will sit as a smelter and purifier of silver. And he will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, so that they may present to Yahweh offerings in righteousness. Then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to Yahweh, as in the days of old, as in former years. So I'm going to clean up my people through the fire, and then I'm going to burn up the rest. I will draw near to you for justice, and I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, against the adulterers, against those who swear falsely, against those who oppress the wager in his wages, the widow, the orphan, and those who turn aside the alien, and do not fear me, says Yahweh of hosts. And do this, friends, do this. Take Malachi 3, verse 5, and read Matthew 23, the whole thing. And you'll see where Jesus got his preaching text. Right here, Malachi 3:5. Judgment is coming. He calls it the judgment of Gehenna in Matthew 23. Judgment is coming upon a wicked and perverse generation for just the very things that Malachi itemizes here in Malachi 3:5. Now, why did I go to this? I went to this because you see the corruption that both Moses in Deuteronomy 32 and Malachi in Malachi 3 said would be when God judged his people through Jesus, or through the work of Jesus. Both were predicting the last generation and the things that would happen when John the Baptist came, in Malachi's case, when God pulled out his avenging sword in Moses' case. But both of them were judging a corrupt society. And then back here in Genesis 6, it was the fact that the people of God had corrupted themselves and brought a judgment upon themselves. I hope you see the parallels that are going on there. In Hebrews 11, at verse 7, there's a connection I want us to see in this regard. By faith, Noah, being warned about things not yet seen, in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. He got to inherit because he was righteous by his faith. His faith prompted him to act. That's another piece of this, but we're talking about the story of Noah, and the Hebrews writer is using the story of Noah to encourage the people of his day to prepare themselves for the coming judgment of God upon their generation. In 1 Peter chapter 3, at verse 20, 1 Peter 3:20, start in verse 18. For Christ also died for sins, once for all, just for unjust, in order that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which also he went and made proclamation to spirits in prison, who once were disobedient, when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah. That's those 120 years, during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely by means of water. And corresponding to that, baptism now saves you. So there was a rescue that took place in the ark, but by means of water, separating them from the sinful world. And Peter says that's what saves you. When you get into Christ and are separated from the sinful world by the water, you'll be saved too. But I'm focusing here on how the story of Genesis 6 informs the New Testament message, that what was happening in the New Testament was covenant judgment, just like it was here in Genesis 6. In 2 Peter 2, beginning at verse 4, and if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, and if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, the bunch of if statements. If God could do that and that and that, then he can spare you when he condemns this world too. And that's the point, that there was a parallel in application of a condemning of the world through a judgment. Well, it was going to be, wasn't it, through a flood, that this judgment was going to be in the form of a flood. In verse 13, and Noah, he said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, and for the land is filled with violence because of them, and I'm about to destroy them with the land. Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood, and you shall make an ark. And he describes the ark in verse 17. For even I am bringing the flood of water upon the earth, the land, to destroy all flesh, which is the breath of life from under heaven. Everything that is on the land shall perish. So I'm going to wipe them out, and I'm going to float you above it. Now, in Psalm 29, hope I can get this last little bit in before we have to sign off. In Psalm 29, we have this wonderful Psalm of David. He's probably listening to a violent thunderstorm, lightning storm, a violent storm. He calls it the voice of the Lord, and voice of Yahweh in verse 3. The voice of Yahweh, verse 4. Again, it's like he's hearing claps of thunder. And he says in verse 9, and in his temple everything says glory. Yahweh sat at the flood. Yes, Yahweh sits as king forever. That flood was not an accident. That was Yahweh in his mighty voice doing what needed to be done, according to David's understanding. Then we have this wonderful picture in the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah 54, we have chapter 52:13 through 53:12 is this beautiful song of the Messiah, who was believed to report, and if he would yield up his life as a guilt offering, he'd see his offspring. And so 54 then says, shout for joy, O barren woman. God's people had not been able to bring forth any living fruit to God. But now, because Messiah is cut off and lives again, shout for joy. Break forth in joyful shouting, he says. In verse 4, he says, fear not, you will not be put to shame. You will not be put to shame or disgrace. This thing is, you're not going to be embarrassed of having trusted in something that doesn't work. Even though I called you a forsaken wife, I'm going to take you, and it was just for a brief moment, but with everlasting loving kindness, I will have compassion on you. That's verse 8. For he says in 9, this is like the days of Noah to me. You get that? The time that Messiah is cut off and then rises again, and the time when God assures his wife, you're going to have lots of children, trust me. This is like the days of Noah to me, when I swore that the waters of Noah should not flood the land again. So I have sworn that I will not be angry with you, nor will I rebuke you. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to rescue you. Now here's the really interesting thing, that back in chapter 8, because you did not trust me, but put your confidence in Rezin and Remaliah, I am going to bring the overwhelming flood of the Assyrians to wipe you out. So here the invasion of this imperial army of the Assyrians is seen as a flood. And over in Revelation 12, when Rome invaded Jerusalem, it's seen as a flood, just like the Assyrian flood. But God says, this is like the days of Noah to me. I'm going to preserve you. And so Peter could say, get in the ark of Jesus through the waters of baptism and let it separate you from the judgment God is bringing upon the world of the ungodly. And so my closing verse here this morning is in Genesis 6, where God is warning Noah, it's corrupt, I'm going to judge it, get in the ark. And then he says, but I will establish my covenant with you. And you shall enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. I'm going to establish my covenant with you. The idea of Genesis 3:15, going to crush the serpent through the seed of the woman. I'm going to establish my covenant with you, Noah. You understand that you are carrying forward this promise, this covenant, to rescue man from the clutches of the serpent. So, great stuff up through chapter 6, eh? We'll pick up there next week. Until then, this is Rod saying, be blessed by Yahweh. Goodbye.
Whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know them. For the ways of Yahweh are right, and the righteous will walk in them, but transgressors will stumble in them. For the past hour, you've been listening to Probing the Prophets with Rod MacArthur. Stay tuned each Friday for Probing the Prophets with Rod MacArthur, right here on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.